the day Harlan Briggs decided to humiliate Mabel Rowan in front of the entire settlement. He did it with a smile on his face. He walked into the Rowan cabin without knocking. He never knocked anymore. Hadn't knocked in months, not since the debt grew large enough that he felt the door belonged to him already. He dropped a folded paper on the table, where Mabel's father lay beneath 2 blankets despite the relative warmth of the afternoon. And he said, loud enough for the neighbors outside to hear through the open window, 2 weeks, girl. 2 weeks and I take the land, the cabin, the tools, and whatever else your dying father hasn't already ruined. Mabel stood at the stove. She did not move. Harlan looked her over the way a man looks at livestock he doesn't intend to buy. Shame, really, he said. If you were worth anything on the marriage market, maybe some fool would have bailed you out by now. But who's going to take on a fat girl with a sick father and a debt she can't count high enough to name? He laughed at his own joke. He was still laughing when he walked back out the door. Mabel stared at the paper on the table. Her father had turned his face toward the wall. If you've ever stood in a room where someone just told you that you were worth nothing, that your body, your poverty, your entire existence was a burden nobody wanted, then you already know what Mabel felt in that moment. And if you've ever had to choose between collapsing under that weight or finding the last hard piece of yourself and standing on it, then you know exactly what she was about to do. Before we go any further, if you're watching this story for the first time, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the stories we bring you don't end where you expect them to. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Mabel Rowan, because her story is just getting started. Mabel Rowan had been 22 years old for exactly 3 weeks when Harlan Briggs gave her family their final notice. She was not a delicate woman. She never had been. She was broad-shouldered and heavy-framed, built the way mountain families sometimes built their daughters, solid, capable, meant for work rather than admiration. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had grown up understanding that the settlement of Granger's Hollow did not consider those particular qualities to be assets. She had heard the remarks since she was old enough to understand them. The grain exchange, at the well, at the edges of church gatherings, her family attended less and less as the money ran out. Other girls her age had already married. Some had married well. Mabel had received no offers, and the settlement had its own explanation. For why? She was too heavy, too poor, and too proud for her station. Combination, in Granger's Hollow's collective opinion, made her essentially unmarriageable. Mabel had long since stopped waiting for the settlement to change its mind. What she had not stopped doing was working. Every morning, before her father woke, she had the fire going and water heating. She managed what remained of their small garden with the precision of someone who understood that 3 rows of beans and a patch of squash were not abundance. They were the difference between eating and not eating. Kept the accounts, such as they were, in a small book she'd found at the bottom of a chest the year her mother died. She wrote the numbers in pencil so she could erase them when they grew too ugly to look at, and then she wrote them again when the new numbers came in, and they were always worse. But her father, Thomas Rowan, had been a capable man once. He'd cleared their land himself, built the cabin with 2 hired hands and his own back, and run a small trapping operation that kept the family in modest comfort through Mabel's early childhood. Then his lungs had started failing him. Not quickly, slowly, the way some illnesses worked, grinding a man down season by season until what remained barely resembled what had been. By the time Mabel was 19, Thomas couldn't manage a full day's work. By 21, he couldn't manage a full morning. Now he spent most of his hours in the bed near the window, and the medical bills from the town doctor in Calverton had compounded on top of the existing land debt until the total figure in Mabel's pencil book was 1. She had stopped the receipt because there was no point pretending it could get better. Harlan Briggs held the paper on that debt. He had bought it from the original creditor 8 months ago, and Mabel had known the moment she heard his name attached to it that the situation had changed in a way that couldn't be changed back. Harlan wasn't in the lending business because he wanted repayment. He was in the lending business because he wanted land, and he had discovered a long time ago that distressed debt was the cheapest way to acquire it. He visited the cabin every 2 weeks. He always found something to say about Mabel's appearance. He did it casually, the way men did when they wanted a woman to understand her position without having to state it plainly. It was never direct enough to be called cruelty outright. It was always delivered with that particular smile, the one that said he already knew the outcome and was simply enjoying the time between now and when it arrived. After he left that afternoon, Mabel read the notice twice. Then she folded it and put it in the pencil book and sat down at the table and looked at her hands. Her father said her name from the bed. "I'm here," she said. "I'm sorry, Mabel." "Stop. I should have Papa." Her voice was flat but not unkind. "There's nothing you should have done differently. You got sick. That's what happened." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "What are we going to do?" Mabel looked at the window. Outside, the light was going gray and thin in the way it did in the mountains when the afternoon started its slide toward evening. She didn't have an answer. She had numbers in a book and 2 weeks, and a father who could not work, and no prospect that she could identify for making any of it change. "I'll think of something," she said. She didn't believe it when she said it, but she said it anyway, because some statements are made not for their accuracy, but for the person who needs to hear them. She was still sitting at the table the next morning when she heard boots on the porch. She had slept perhaps 2 hours. She'd spent most of the night with the pencil book open in front of her, working the numbers from every direction she could imagine, trying to find some combination of what they owned and what she might earn and what time remained that could produce a different result. The numbers did not cooperate. They sat on the page with the indifference of arithmetic, immune to hope or effort or desperation. When the knock came a real knock, 3 firm raps, not Harlan's presumptuous entry, Mabel looked up. She opened the door. The man on the porch was not anyone she recognized. He was perhaps 40, or somewhere in that territory. It was hard to say precisely, because his face had been weathered by outdoor, living in a way that aged and preserved simultaneously. He was not large, but he was solid, the kind of solid that came from physical work over many years rather than from size. He wore trapper's clothing that had seen considerable use, a canvas coat with repairs at both elbows, boots that were functional rather than new. His hat was pulled against the morning cold. He was carrying nothing. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Not a question." "That's right. My name is Colter Wren." He said it without emphasis, the way a man states a fact he has no particular attachment to. "I've got a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear it." Mabel studied him. She had learned over the years to read men who came to her door with propositions. Most of them were selling something she couldn't afford, or collecting something she couldn't pay, or offering work that paid less than the work cost. She looked at this man's coat and his worn boots and his plain expression, and she made the quick calculation that mountain women learn to make: threat assessment, intention assessment, the silent arithmetic of whether to open the door wider or close it entirely. She opened it wider. "Come in," she said. He took his hat off when he entered, which she noted. He looked at her father in the bed, acknowledged him with a brief nod, and then looked at Mabel. "I'll be plain," he said. "Good," she said. "Sit if you want." He didn't sit. "I'm looking for a wife. I heard about your family's situation. I'm prepared to pay off the debt to Harlan Briggs in full and provide your father with access to a doctor, a better one than what you've got in Calverton, if you'll agree to marry me and come back to my property in the mountains." The room was very quiet. Mabel heard her father shift in the bed. She didn't look at him. "Why?" she said. "I need a wife who is practical, who is not afraid of hardship, who can think clearly when things are difficult." He paused. "I have reasons for those requirements that I'm not prepared to explain in full right now, but I'll answer what questions I can." "How do you know I'm any of those things?" "I asked around," he said, "carefully, over several weeks. You manage this household. You keep your father's spirits from collapsing. You handle Harlan Briggs without losing your composure. That tells me something. It tells you I'm desperate, Mabel said. It tells me you're capable. He said it without inflection. Desperate people make poor decisions. You haven't. Not yet. Mabel sat down at the table. She looked at this man, his worn coat, his unremarkable boots, his face that gave nothing away, and she thought about the paper in her pencil book, and Harlan Briggs's smile, and her father's deteriorating lungs, and the numbers that did not move, regardless of how many nights she spent trying to rearrange them. You're a poor man, she said. It was an observation, not a judgment. I live simply, he said. How are you going to pay off a debt of this size if you live simply? Something shifted in his expression, not much, barely perceptible. I have resources available to me, he said. That's all I'll say at present. It was not a satisfying answer. Mabel knew it wasn't a satisfying answer. She could see that he knew it, too. I have conditions, she said. He looked at her steadily. Tell me. I want to visit my father regularly. That means the property you're talking about cannot be so remote that travel is impossible. It's remote, he said, but not impossible. We can arrange visits. I want my own money, not an allowance, my own earnings, whatever I can generate through my own work. A pause. That can be arranged. I want a written agreement, not just words. Something on paper that says, this is a partnership, not an arrangement where I belong to you. He was quiet for a moment longer this time. I'll have it drafted. And if I find after a reasonable period that this arrangement is intolerable, I want an exit, a real one, not a woman's version of an exit that leaves her with nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. She could not read his expression, and that bothered her because she was generally good at reading expressions. He was either a man of unusual self-control or a man with nothing to hide, and she had learned that those two things could look identical from the outside. You're asking for things most women don't think to ask for, he said. I'm not most women, she said. That's presumably why you're here. Corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest approximation she would see from him that morning. I'll agree to your conditions, he said, with one of my own. You give the arrangement 1 full year before invoking any exit. I need enough time to know if this can work. Mabel looked at her father. Thomas Rowan was watching her from the bed, with an expression she recognized, the one he'd worn when she was small, and made decisions he wasn't sure about. Not disapproval. Something more careful than that. He had always let her make her own choices, even the ones that frightened him. I need to discuss it with my father privately, she said. If you'd give us a few minutes. Colter Wren put his hat back on and walked outside without comment. Mabel went to her father's side. He seems decent, Thomas said quietly. He seems controlled, Mabel said. That's not the same thing. No. Thomas reached for her hand. His grip was weaker than it had been a year ago, and the awareness of that was a physical thing in Mabel's chest. What do you want to do? I don't know what I want, she said honestly. I know what the numbers say. The numbers aren't everything. They're close to everything right now, Papa. He was quiet for a moment. You don't have to do this for me. Mabel looked at him, at his gray face, and the effort it cost him to breathe in the cold air and the pride he was trying to hold on to despite everything. And she felt the familiar combination of love and grief and anger that had been sitting in her chest for the better part of 2 years. I know I don't have to, she said. She squeezed his hand and stood up and went back to the door. Colter Wren was standing on the porch, looking out at the mountain slope, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath making small clouds in the air. He didn't turn around at her approach. I'll need the agreement in writing before the wedding, she said, and I'll need the debt paid to Briggs directly. Not through me, I want a receipt. Turned. Agreed. And I want to know one more thing before I say yes. He waited. Do you understand what you're asking me to give up? Because it's not just this cabin. Only life I know. Her voice was even. I'm not complaining about that life. I'm telling you that I understand what I'm trading. I want to know that you understand it too. He looked at her for a long moment. I understand it more than you know, he said, and I won't pretend the trade is equal. What I'm offering is different, not better. You'll have to decide for yourself what that's worth. It was, Mabel thought, the most honest thing he'd said since he walked through her door. She held out her hand. He shook it. News moved through Granger's Hollow the way. News always moved through small settlements faster than logic could explain, and with considerably more embellishment than the facts warranted. By the following afternoon, the story of Mabel Rowan's arrangement with the mountain stranger had already passed through a dozen tellings, and with each telling it had acquired a new layer of contempt. At the grain exchange, two women discussed it in voices just loud enough to carry. The livery. Three men made the kind of jokes that men make when they believe they're cleverer than they are. Harlan Briggs, when told that his debt would be paid in full by a trapper named Wren, had laughed until his face turned red and then sobered and said something about how a fool and his money were soon parted, and that whoever this Wren character was, he'd apparently gone all the way to desperate measures to find a woman who'd have him. The implication was clear. Mabel had heard versions of that implication her entire life. The logic ran like this: a poor, heavy, uneducated mountain girl was the bottom of the available options, and any man who chose her was either equally worthless or suffering from some defect of judgment that would become apparent in time. Mabel heard what the settlement was saying. She heard it specifically because Agnes Pruitt, who ran the dry goods, and who had never been capable of letting information sit unused, made a point of repeating the worst of it directly to Mabel's face when she came in to purchase thread 2 days before the wedding. "People are talking," Agnes said, with the particular tone of someone who has contributed significantly to the talking. "People always talk," Mabel said. She examined a spool of brown thread and set it back. "They're saying you've gone and agreed to marry a nobody just because you couldn't do better." She selected gray thread instead. "Some of them are saying it's sad, really. You had to sell yourself because no decent man would have you." Agnes leaned on her counter. "I'm just telling you what's being said. So you know." Mabel put the thread on the counter and found the coins for it in her coat pocket. "Agnes," she said pleasantly, "what percentage of what you've just told me was for my benefit, and what percentage was because you wanted to watch my face when you said it?" Agnes opened her mouth. "Don't answer that," Mabel said. "I don't actually need to know." She picked up her thread. "Good afternoon." She walked out of the dry goods without looking back, and she did not allow her expression to change until she had rounded the corner of the building and was out of sight. Then she stopped, and she pressed her back against the rough timber wall, and she let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds, the burn of it, the familiar ache of being measured and found insufficient by people who had never once tried to look past the measurement. 60 seconds. Then she straightened up, tucked the thread into her pocket, and walked back toward home. She had a wedding to prepare for and a future to figure out, and she could not afford to spend more than 60 seconds on what Granger's Hollow thought of her choices. The wedding was small, was functional, and conducted by the settlement's justice of the peace, a thin man named Aldous Burke, who performed the ceremony with the speed and minimal ornamentation of someone who had other things to do. 3 people attended. Thomas Rowan, propped up with an extra blanket despite the warm day, watching his daughter from a chair that Mabel had insisted be brought from the cabin. A man named Dix, who apparently worked for Colter and whom Mabel had never seen before, and Agnes Pruitt, who had come uninvited and stood at the back with an expression of fastidious curiosity. Colter Wren said his part of the ceremony in a quiet, clear voice. He did not look uncomfortable or reluctant. He looked, Mabel thought, like a man completing a transaction he had thought through carefully, not cold, exactly, but deliberate. There was a difference. Mabel said her part in an equally clear voice. The justice pronounced them married. Colter did not kiss her. They had not discussed it, but she was grateful for the omission. He offered his hand, instead, the same businesslike handshake he'd offered 3 days ago on her porch, and she shook it. And it occurred to her that this might be the most honest marriage ceremony she had ever witnessed. Two people agreeing to something difficult, with their eyes open, without pretending it was something it wasn't. After, he shook Thomas Rowan's hand with what appeared to be genuine care, and he told him that the arrangements with the doctor in Harlan County would be in place within the week. Thomas gripped his hand for a longer moment than necessary. "She's the finest person I know," he said. Colter looked at Mabel. "I believe it," he said, and his expression, for just that moment, was different from the controlled blankness he'd maintained since their first meeting, something that was not quite open, but was no longer quite closed. Then it was gone, and he was the deliberate, unreadable man again. They left the following morning. Mabel had allowed herself 1 hour the night before to sit beside her father and say the things that needed saying without either of them falling apart. She had packed what she owned in a single canvas bag and a smaller leather satchel. She had gone through the cabin once before sleeping, checking the fire, checking the supplies, making a list for the neighbor woman who had agreed to look in on Thomas each day until the new medical arrangements could be made. And then she had lain awake until 3 in the morning, which was not unusual. She was not afraid of what she was riding toward. That surprised her a little. What she felt was something closer to the tension of stepping onto uncertain ground, that very specific alertness that came from not knowing what was beneath your foot before the weight settled. She mounted the horse Colter provided without help. She arranged her satchel. She looked back once at the cabin, where her father stood in the doorway, one hand raised. She raised hers in return. Then she turned forward and followed her husband into the mountains. And whatever was going to happen to Mabel Rowan, it was going to happen out there. She had spent her entire life being told what she was worth. She was about to find out what she could do. The mountains did not care about Mabel Rowan. That was the first thing she understood about them. The trail Colter led her along climbed in a way that made the horse work and made her work and made everything that had happened in Granger's Hollow feel simultaneously very far away and very irrelevant. The settlement's opinions, Harlan Briggs' smile, Agnes Pruitt's careful cruelties, none of it had any traction up here. The mountain simply rose, and you either rose with it or you didn't, and it had no feelings about which you chose. Mabel rose with it. They traveled for most of the first day without much conversation. Colter rode ahead on a dark bay horse that knew the trail well enough to navigate without guidance, which told Mabel this was not a path he used infrequently. Dix, the man who had stood at their wedding, rode behind her on a mule loaded with supplies. He was perhaps 50, with a face like old saddle leather, and a complete apparent disinterest in small talk, which Mabel found she didn't mind. Around midday, they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses. Mabel climbed down and stretched her legs and watched Colter check the mule's load with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "How long to your property?" she asked. "Another 2 days," he said, without looking up from the lashing. "Is there somewhere to shelter tonight?" "There's a line camp about 3 hours north. We'll make it before dark if we keep moving." She nodded. He didn't elaborate. They kept moving. The line camp was a single-room structure with a stone fireplace, 2 rope cots, and a small supply of split wood stacked under an overhang outside. It smelled of pine resin and old smoke and the particular cold that settled into spaces that were only occasionally heated. Dix made a fire with the efficiency of a man who had been making fires in rough conditions his entire life. Mabel unpacked the food Colter had brought and assembled a simple meal from what was available: dried meat, hard biscuit, a tin of preserved beans she heated directly in the fire. Nobody complained about the food. Nobody praised it either. They ate in the quiet that 3 people fell into when they were tired and had no established conversational rhythms. After, Colter took the cot near the door, and Dix rolled his bedroll in the corner, and Mabel took the second cot and lay on her back, looking at the rough-hewn ceiling in the firelight, and thought about the fact that she was now married to a man she had known for 3 days. She had made worse decisions, she supposed. She couldn't immediately identify one, but she supposed it was possible. The second day was harder than the first. The trail climbed more steeply and in places disappeared entirely into open rocky terrain that required Colter to navigate by landmarks. Mabel couldn't read. She watched how he moved, the way he checked the position of a particular ridgeline, the way he oriented himself against a certain distinctive rock formation, and she filed the information away in the part of her mind that had always collected practical things. Late in the afternoon of the second day, the trail descended through a dense stand of fir trees and then leveled. And then Colter stopped his horse and turned in the saddle and looked back at her. "Through those trees," he said. She rode forward until she was beside him, and she looked where he indicated, and the trees opened, and Mabel saw the valley. She did not have a word for it immediately. The valley was broad, broader than it had appeared from the ridge above, an optical trick of the surrounding cliffs that compressed the sense of scale until you were actually inside it. It ran perhaps 2 miles end to end, sheltered on 3 sides by granite faces that climbed several hundred feet above the tree line, and along its floor a creek ran gray-green and clear through meadow grass that was still half-brown from winter but showed the early yellow-green of coming growth along its edges. That was the valley. What was in the valley was something else entirely. Mabel counted buildings before she counted anything else, because her mind went immediately to the practical. And what the buildings told her was a story that did not match the man riding beside her in his patched canvas coat. There were barns, 2 of them, large, properly constructed, with sound roof lines. There were workshops. She could see the shape of them, structures built for specific work rather than general storage. There were long, low buildings that looked like bunkhouses. There were gardens in various stages of spring preparation, and a kitchen structure separate from the main lodge, and what appeared to be a blacksmith's operation, judging by the anvil visible even from this distance. And there was the lodge. It was built from the timber that surrounded it, massive, fitted logs that had been worked, and joined with a care that said craftsmen had done this, not just laborers. It was 2 stories with a wide porch across the front, and it sat at the head of the valley with the particular settled quality of a building that had been placed where it belonged and had proceeded to belong there for some time. There were people moving between the buildings, a dozen at least, maybe more. Mabel sat on her horse and looked at all of it, and felt something shift in her understanding of her situation in a way that was not entirely comfortable. "This is yours," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Colter said. "All of it. Yes." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her face with an attention that she recognized now, the same attention he'd given her on the porch of her family's cabin, the same careful, measuring quality. He was reading her reaction. He had been reading her reactions since the moment he walked through her door. "You're not a poor mountain trapper," she said. "No, you let me believe you were." He met her eyes steadily. "I let you make your decision without information that would have changed how you made it. That was deliberate." The temperature of Mabel's reaction surprised her. She had thought, riding up here, that she was a person who had prepared herself for surprises, that 2 days of mountain travel had given her enough time to adjust her expectations downward or sideways or in whatever direction was necessary. She had been wrong. The size of the gap between what she'd assumed and what she was looking at was large enough that anger moved through her before she could redirect it into something more useful. "Get down from your horse," she said. Colter blinked, a rare expression of genuine surprise. "I'm sorry? I want to talk to you on the ground. Not up here, where I have to look sideways at you while managing a horse." He dismounted. She dismounted. Dix, with the instincts of a man who had learned to make himself scarce at the right moments, rode on ahead toward the valley, with the mule trailing behind him. Mabel stood in front of her husband in the thin afternoon light at the edge of the tree line, and she said what she was thinking, which was her established method, when her established method was required. "You need to explain to me what I've actually walked into," she said. "Not the version you were going to give me gradually while you watched how I handled each piece of it. The whole version now." Colter was quiet for a moment. A muscle worked in his jaw, the first uncontrolled physical thing she'd seen from him. "Fair," he said. He told her. The Wren timber operation had been established by his father, James Wren, roughly 18 years prior. James had identified the valley and its surrounding forests as exceptional timberland, the right species mix, the right elevation, accessible by mountain trail to river transport further west that connected to mill operations in the lowland settlements. He had spent 3 years, and most of his available capital establishing the compound, hiring skilled workers, developing relationships with the mills, and building what had become one of the more productive private timber operations in that section of the territory. James Wren had died 4 years ago. He had left the operation to Colter. He had left a second piece of business to Colter as well, which was a brother, James's younger brother, Roderick Wren, who had worked in the operation's financial management for a decade, and who had come to the conclusion, over time, that he was better suited to run the enterprise than his nephew. Roderick had not received the inheritance. Roderick had, in Colter's measured telling, not accepted this outcome. He's been working to undermine me since the week after my father's burial, Colter said. He controls relationships with 2 of our 3 major mill accounts. He has access to the financial records from his years managing the books. And he has a long-standing friendship with 2 members of the Territorial Investment Group that holds a partial stake in the operation. Mabel processed this. He's building a case to have you removed, or to force a buyout at a figure that benefits him. The effect is the same. What's the case he's building? Colter's jaw tightened again. That I'm inexperienced. That my decisions about sustainable cutting practice, limiting harvest in certain areas to allow regeneration, are reducing output and therefore reducing value. He's framing it as mismanagement. Is it mismanagement? He looked at her directly. No, it's longer thinking. You cut everything now. You destroy the resource base within a decade, and the operation collapses. Cut selectively, and you have productive forest for a generation. But it reduces short-term output, yes. And the investors care about short-term output. More than they care about what happens in 20 years. Yes. Mabel turned and looked at the valley again. The barns, the people moving between buildings. Scope of it that she was only now beginning to correctly measure. What does any of this have to do with why you needed a wife? She said. Colter was quiet for a moment. Part of Roderick's argument is that I'm unstable, unsettled. That I'm not the kind of man who builds an enterprise. I'm the kind who maintains one carelessly until it deteriorates. A married man with a stake in permanence reads differently to investors than a solitary one. Mabel turned back to look at him. You needed a wife for appearances. Partly, he said it without flinching. I also needed what I told you I needed. Someone practical. Someone who thinks clearly under pressure. Someone who isn't going to crumble when Roderick, and he will turns his attention to her. He'll come after me. He'll try to use you, to embarrass me through you. He paused. He's not a gentle man in his methods. Mabel considered everything that had been said in the last 10 minutes. She thought about Harlan Briggs dropping that paper on her father's table. She thought about Agnes Pruitt's careful, pleasurable delivery of the settlement's contempt. She thought about a lifetime of being used as a measuring stick. You are not worth this. You are not worth that. And what it had actually produced in her, which was not what the people wielding the stick had intended. You should have told me this before the wedding, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. It was a plain admission. No qualifier, no deflection. She hadn't expected it. I'm angry about it, she said. I know, I'm going to need some time before I'm not angry about it. That's fair. She looked at the valley one more time, and then she picked up her horse's reins and started walking down toward it. Then let's go see what I've married into, she said. The compound was larger up close than it had appeared from the ridge. Bookkeeping, which Mabel would later understand, was a property of the valley's geography. The cliffs created a compressed visual field that consistently made distances shorter and spaces smaller until you were actually inside them. She walked her horse through the main yard, between buildings, and watched and listened and took stock. The workers she passed ranged in age from a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 to a man she estimated at 65. They were mostly men, but not entirely. She noted two women managing the kitchen structure, and another woman working in what appeared to be a large garden being prepared for the season's planting. The workers looked at her with the contained curiosity of people who had been told something was coming and were now measuring the reality against whatever they'd been told. She met their looks with a level gaze and kept walking. Inside the lodge, a woman named Hester ran the household. She was perhaps 45, broad-built and quick-moving, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely, and eyes that assessed Mabel in the first 3 seconds, with a completeness that Mabel recognized because she did it herself. "Mrs. Wren," Hester said, with a formality that was neither warm nor hostile. "Hester," Mabel said, because Colter had told her the name on the way down. The whole house, the storerooms, the kitchen, the supplies at records. "Not today. Today, I just want to know where things are." But within the week, Hester blinked. "The supply records. And the household accounts, if you keep them separately." Pause. "You're familiar with accounts?" "I kept my family's for 4 years," Mabel said. "I'm not unfamiliar." Something shifted in Hester's assessment. It didn't become warm, but it became something more like attention. "I'll show you where everything is kept," she said. The room Colter had arranged for her was on the lodge's upper floor, a proper room, not large but sufficient, with a window that faced east toward the cliff wall. There was a bed, a dresser, a small writing desk, and a lamp. There were curtains that someone had made with care. Mabel set her canvas bag on the dresser and her leather satchel on the desk and stood in the room for a moment with her hands at her sides. It was, she realized, the first room she had ever had entirely to herself. In the cabin, she had shared with the main living space. There had been no such thing as a private room. She sat down at the desk and opened the satchel and took out her pencil book. She opened it to a clean page. She wrote, "Day 1, Valley Compound, much larger than expected." Then she sat and thought and wrote down everything she had observed. Because she was a person who processed by writing things down, and because she had a feeling she was going to need to have observed carefully. Colter gave her the first week without pressure, which she appreciated and did not say so, because it was what she had needed, and she hadn't had to ask for it. She used the time the way she had told Hester she intended to, going through the lodge, systematically, learning the supply situation, learning the names and functions of the people working the compound. She also spent part of each day reading. Colter's office, a room off the main hall of the lodge, fitted with a large work table and 3 walls of shelving, contained not just the business records she had expected, but a substantial collection of books on forestry, land management, and commercial operations in frontier territories. She began reading them in the evenings. She read slowly and carefully, the way she'd always read anything that mattered, stopping to think through the logic of what she was encountering and how it connected to what she'd already observed. At the end of the first week, she came to dinner, with a question. It was just the 2 of them at the table. They ate with the workers at midday, but the evening meal in the lodge was typically the 2 of them and Hester, who ate in the kitchen. Colter was working through some correspondence when Mabel sat down. "Your sustainable cutting plan," she said. "What's the projected yield difference between your approach and what Roderick is arguing for?" He looked up from the letters. "In the first 5 years, his approach produces roughly 30% higher output. And after 5 years, my approach begins to close the gap as regenerated areas come back into rotation. By year 10, we're likely comparable. By year 15, my approach is more productive because we haven't stripped the primary growth stands. What's the current valuation methodology the investment group uses?" He set down the correspondence. 5-year projected yield. So they're measuring you on exactly the window where Roderick's approach looks better. Yes. And your records show the sustainable approach's long-term projections. How? They're in the business ledgers. The projections are my father's original calculations, updated with my own observations over the past 4 years. Mabel put down her fork. "Can I look at those ledgers?" Colter was quiet for a moment. She couldn't read his expression again that was becoming familiar. "Yes," he said. She spent the next 3 evenings with the ledgers. They were detailed records, maintained with the consistency of someone who had understood that records were a form of argument, that the numbers, kept carefully enough over enough time, told a story that verbal claims could not. James Wren had been a systematic man, and Colter had continued in the same manner. What Mabel found, working through the figures, was not simple. The numbers were honest. Roderick's short-term yield argument was arithmetically correct. A more aggressive cutting schedule would produce higher output in the current window. But what the numbers also showed, if you read them all the way through and applied the regeneration calculations James had developed from his observation of the forest's recovery rates, was a different picture over time. A much better picture. A picture that Roderick's version of events simply stopped before it arrived. She made her own set of notes. She worked through the calculations from a different angle, checking James's methodology against her own reasoning. He had been right. The math held. On the 4th evening, she came to the office and set her notes on the table beside the ledgers and said, "He's not wrong about the short-term numbers, but he's stopping the story at the wrong place." Colter looked at her notes for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "That's exactly what he's doing. Problem is that your investors aren't reading 20 years of ledgers. They're reading Roderick's summary, which is accurate as far as it goes, which is accurate for 5 years, and then becomes a fiction." She sat down across from him. "You need a different document. Not the ledgers. Those are too much for someone to read who doesn't want to read them. You need something that tells the full story in a way someone can absorb in 20 minutes. Colter looked at her steadily. "Can you do that?" Mabel looked back at him. "I'm going to need your father's original forestry observations and your own records of regeneration rates in the areas you've already put on rest rotation." He got up and pulled 3 bound journals from the bottom shelf. He set them on the table. "My father's," he said, "and 2 of mine." She opened the first one. James Wren's handwriting was even and clear, a man who had written, knowing others might need to read it. "Give me a week," she said. She did not finish in a week. She finished in 9 days, because the regeneration data was more complex than she'd initially estimated, and she refused to simplify it past the point of honesty. What she produced was not long 12 pages, written in a plain voice that did not require forestry knowledge to follow, that laid out the operation's history, the sustainable cutting philosophy, the 5-year yield comparison and what it missed, and the 20-year projection with the data that supported it. She gave it to Colter and watched him read it at the office table. He read it twice without speaking. He turned back to certain pages. He put it down. "This is very good," he said. "I know," she said. Was not arrogance. It was the honest assessment of someone who had checked her own work carefully and found it sound. He looked at her with that expression she still couldn't entirely read. "Where did you learn to do this?" "I didn't learn it anywhere," she said. "I just thought about what someone who didn't know anything about timber would need to understand, and I tried to give them that." He was quiet for a moment. "Mabel." It was the first time he had used her given name without a Mrs. in front of it. "You should have been doing work like this for years," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I should have." There was something in that exchange that neither of them acknowledged directly, but that sat at between them differently than the careful, businesslike distance they had maintained for the past 2 weeks. Not warmer, exactly, but less like 2 people conducting a transaction and more like 2 people who were beginning to locate each other in the same landscape. Roderick Wren arrived in the valley on a Tuesday in April. Mabel knew he was coming before he arrived, because Colter had received a letter 10 days prior, informing him that Roderick and 2 representatives of the Territorial Investment Group intended to conduct a review of the operations management. The letter had been written in the tone of someone who had the authority to conduct such a review, whether or not it was welcomed. "What do you want me to do?" Mabel asked, when Colter told her. "Whatever you think is right," he said. She had not expected that answer. You're not going to tell me to stay in the lodge and be pleasant and not say anything that might complicate things?" "No." She looked at him. Why not? Because I told you this marriage was a partnership, he said. I meant it. She studied his face for a moment. You'd better have meant it, she said, because I'm going to be in that room. Roderick Wren was a larger man than Colter, and louder in the way some men were loud, not in volume necessarily, but in presence, in the amount of space he occupied with his certainty and his expectation of deference. He had gray at his temples and a rancher's coat, and the look of a man who had spent years being the most important person in most of the rooms he walked into. He walked into the lodge's main room on that Tuesday afternoon, and his eyes moved immediately to Mabel, and what crossed his face was not subtle. This must be the wife, he said. Mabel met his gaze. Mabel Wren, she said. And you're Roderick. I've heard a good deal about you. He looked her over with the deliberateness of a man who wanted her to know she was being assessed. It was a different version of Harlan Briggs's look, but the same species. I'm sure you have, he said. He extended his hand and shook hers with the brief efficiency of a man who considers the courtesy complete. Where did Colter find you? Granger's Hollow, she said. Mountain settlement. He made the two words do a great deal of work. Well, different kind of woman than what the valley's been used to. Two investment representatives men named Galt and Birch, both from the territorial capital, watched this exchange with the polite blankness of men whose job required them to observe without committing. Colter said, We've arranged dinner for tonight and a full review of the operation tomorrow. Dix will show you to your rooms. Roderick nodded slowly, still looking at Mabel. Good. I imagine the review will be illuminating. He smiled. Everyone. Dinner that evening was a performance of civility stretched over a frame of active opposition, and everyone at the table knew it. Roderick had the practiced social smoothness of a man who had learned that conversation could be used as a weapon. If wielded carefully, he made remarks that were technically courteous and structurally contemptuous, the kind of thing that required a precise ear to identify and a particular confidence to respond to without appearing to take offense at something that had been engineered to be deniable. He asked Mabel how she was adjusting to mountain life in a tone that made the question a comment on how much adjusting a woman like her would require. He referred to Granger's Hollow twice more, each time in a way that measured her against its limitations. He made a comment about Colter's domestic decisions that sat adjacent to the word impulsive without actually being it. Mabel ate her food and listened and did not take any of the bait. She asked Galt and Birch questions about the territorial capital, genuine questions, about current timber prices in the lowland markets, about the investment group's other holdings, about what they looked for when evaluating a frontier operation. They answered, with increasing attentiveness. She could see, not what they had expected to find in this valley this rate, and the discrepancy was making them curious. After dinner, when Roderick had retired and Galt and Birch were having a final drink by the fire, Mabel excused herself. In the hallway, Colter caught up with her. You held back tonight, he said quietly. Yes, she said. Why, because tomorrow is the actual meeting, she said. Tonight was just Roderick announcing his intentions. I didn't need to respond to intentions. He looked at her for a long moment. Some sleep, he said. He'll be worse in the morning. She did not sleep well. She lay in her room and thought through the conversation she expected would happen and prepared for the versions of it she could anticipate. She was not afraid of Roderick Wren. She had been afraid of less specific things for most of her life, the creeping fear of an impossible debt, the quiet fear of a father's diminishing strength, particular fear of being the only person standing between a disaster and the people you loved. Roderick Wren was a man with specific goals, using specific methods, and specific things could be addressed specifically. She was up before anyone else, and at the desk in her room, going through her notes by lamplight, when the sky outside the window began to change from black to dark blue to the gray pink of early mountain morning. The review meeting took place in Colter's office, with the work table cleared and chairs arranged and a fire that Hester had built up to combat the morning chill. Galt and Birch sat on one side. Colter sat at the head of the table. Roderick sat across from the investors with the relaxed posture of someone who expected the meeting to unfold in his favor. Mabel sat beside Colter. Roderick's eyes moved to her when she sat down. She held his gaze and said nothing. Roderick began his presentation with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared it carefully and revised it more than once. He laid out the 5-year yield comparison. He presented his figures, accurate figures, Mabel noted. He had done his homework, and he described the sustainable cutting program as a well-intentioned approach that was demonstrably underperforming relative to standard territorial practice. He described Colter as dedicated but inexperienced. He described the operation as having potential that was being underutilized. He did not mention Mabel, but twice he glanced at her with an expression that communicated his assessment of her presence in this room. Colt asked several questions. Birch made notes. The atmosphere had the settled quality of a conversation whose conclusion was already visible. Then Mabel put the 12-page document on the table. Before the meeting closes, she said, I'd ask that you take 20 minutes with this. Roderick looked at the document. What is that? A fuller picture, she said. Your numbers are correct, Mr. Wren. I want to be clear about that. I've checked them against the ledgers, and they're accurate. He blinked. He had not expected her to open with that. But they end at 5 years, she continued, and the story of this operation doesn't end at 5 years. She looked at Galt, then Birch. What you've been given is accurate and incomplete. Those are two different problems, and I'd suggest they require different responses. She walked them through it. Not all 12 pages. She knew which sections mattered, and she moved through them cleanly, pointing to the regeneration data, explaining James Wren's methodology and the 4 years of observed evidence that had validated it, showing what the 20-year projection looked like when the full data was in the picture. She was precise, and she was plain, and she did not raise her voice. Roderick interrupted twice. Both times she addressed his interruption directly and acknowledged what was accurate in it, and returned to her point. The third time he tried to interrupt, she said, Let me finish the section, and then I'll take your question, in a tone that closed the interruption without hostility, and he did not try a fourth time. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Birch looked at the document. He turned to the page with the regeneration calculations. Prepared this, he said. I did, Mabel said. He looked at her steadily. From what source material? The operations ledgers from 18 years of records, James Wren's forestry journals, and 4 years of Colter Wren's own observation logs from the rest rotation areas. Everything cited in the document can be verified against primary records. Galt leaned forward. Mrs. Wren. He said the name with a different quality than Roderick had used it. Have you worked in resource management before? No, she said. I've worked in survival. It teaches similar principles. Roderick's voice when it came was different from his earlier fluency. The controlled pleasantness was still there, but the ease was gone from it. This is an interesting document, he said, but I'd note that it's been prepared by someone with no professional background in. The calculations are either correct or they're not, Mabel said, kept her voice even. The methodology is James Wren's, which you presumably accepted when he used it to build this operation. If you have a specific objection to the arithmetic, I'll address it. If the objection is to who did the arithmetic, that's a different kind of argument. Galt looked at Birch. Birch was still looking at the document. Roderick stared at Mabel. She looked back at him. What she saw in his face in that moment was not anger, not yet. It was the recalculation of a man who had walked into a room expecting a particular set of pieces on a board and had found instead that several of them had been moved while he wasn't watching. She had spent her entire life being this piece people moved without considering. She had learned over time how to move herself. Galt said, I think we should take some time with this document before we continue. Roderick said nothing. Colter said, Of course, the meeting was suspended for 2 hours while Galt and Birch read. During those 2 hours, Roderick found Mabel in the kitchen, where she was helping Hester with the midday meal, not because she needed to, but because her hands worked better when her mind was occupied, and he stood in the doorway with his controlled pleasantness entirely gone and said, in a voice that was meant to be too quiet for Hester to hear, "Clever little performance." Mabel continued slicing bread. "Thank you. You understand that this isn't finished." She looked up. "I know that. Did you think I thought it was?" He studied her. The assessment in his eyes was different now from what it had been at dinner. He was looking at her without the comfortable assumption of her irrelevance, and she could see him recategorizing and not liking the category he was arriving at. "You're a mountain girl from a poor settlement who married my nephew for his money," he said. "That's the story. That's what everyone knows." Mabel put down the bread knife. She looked at him with the steadiness she had developed over years of having people tell her what she was, and she said, "People have been telling me what my story is since I was old enough to understand what they were saying." She picked the knife back up. "They've been wrong about it every time." Roderick left the kitchen. Hester, who had heard every word, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That bread is sliced thin enough." "I know," Mabel said. "Good." Hester moved a pot on the stove. "Lunch will be ready in 20 minutes. When the meeting resumed in the afternoon, it was shorter than the morning session. Golt asked several specific questions about the regeneration timeline that Mabel answered from the journals she had brought with her. Birch asked about the relationship between the rest rotation areas and the overall cutting schedule. Colter answered that one himself and answered it. Well, he knew this land and this forest in a way that no document could fully capture. And when he spoke about it, there was a quiet authority in him that had nothing to do with performance. Roderick made 2 more attempts to redirect the conversation toward his 5-year argument. Both times he was gently redirected back by Golt. At the end of the afternoon, Golt said that the investment group would be in contact within the month with their assessment, and that the document Mrs. Wren had prepared would be included in the materials they reviewed. It was not a victory. Mabel was careful not to read it as one. It was at best the shift of a conversation that had been heading in one direction into something less certain. What happened next was not in her hands. But Roderick Wren left the valley the following morning without the outcome he had arrived expecting. She watched the horses go from the lodge porch without visible satisfaction, because satisfaction struck her as premature. Colter stood beside her on the porch. After a long moment, he said, "You didn't have to do any of that." "I know," she said. "You prepared that document before you knew what he'd say in the meeting." "I prepared it when I understood what the situation was," she said. Same thing. He was quiet. Below them, the valley went about its morning workers, moving between buildings. Smoke from the kitchen, the distant sound of an axe somewhere in the trees. Why, he said. Not what had she done. Why, she thought about that for a moment. She thought about the 12-page document, and the 9 days of evenings, and the pencil book, and her father's face, and the number that had sat in the ledger like a sentence, and Harlan Briggs's smile. "Because it needed doing," she said, "and I could do it." She went back inside. On the desk in her room, the pencil book was open to a page of notes she'd made the night before. She sat down and read through them and crossed out 2 things and added 1 new observations and sat back and looked out the window at the cliff face across the valley. She had married a stranger and ridden into the mountains and found an empire when she expected a hardship, and the empire had its own kind of hardship, which was complicated and dangerous and would not resolve itself quickly. Picked up the pencil. She wrote, "The numbers are right. The story isn't finished." Then she turned to a new page and kept working. The letter from the Territorial Investment Group arrived on a Friday morning in late May, 6 weeks after Roderick's visit. Mabel was in the garden when Dix brought it up from the trail, where a rider from the lowland settlements delivered correspondence twice monthly. She watched Colter take the letter from Dix's hand and turn it over once, and then carry it inside without opening it in the yard, which told her something about him that he did not want his reaction observed by the workers before he had managed it. She finished what she was doing in the garden. She washed her hands at the pump. She went inside. Colter was standing at the window in his office, with the letter open in his hand. He did not turn when she came in. "Good news or bad?" she said. "Neither," he said. A delay. He handed her the letter, written in the careful language of men who were not yet ready to commit. The investment group wished to conduct a more thorough review before rendering any determination regarding the operations management structure. They had engaged an independent assessor, a man named Frederick Goss, from the territorial capital, who would visit the valley in approximately 8 weeks to examine the operations records, practices, and long-term viability. The group would reach its conclusion following Goss's report. Mabel read it twice. "Do you know Goss?" "By reputation." Colter moved to the table and sat. "He's competent, thorough. He works for whoever pays him, but he doesn't falsify his findings. He's worth more to people with an honest reputation than a dishonest one. So Roderick can't buy his conclusion." "No. He can only buy his attention, which he's already done by pushing for the review." Colter looked at the letter on the table. 8 weeks gives Roderick time to prepare his own presentation. He'll be ready. "So will we," Mabel said. Colter looked up at her. There was something in his expression that she had begun to recognize over the past weeks, a quality of reassessment, as though he kept arriving at her and finding something different from what he'd expected. She wasn't sure yet what he'd expected. She wasn't sure he knew either. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said. "You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it." Mabel pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Colter, I read those forestry journals. I went through 18 years of ledgers. I spent 9 days writing a document that I believe is correct." She put her hands flat on the table. "If Goss comes here and Roderick gets to shape what he sees, everything I did gets undone. I'm not interested in doing work that gets undone." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right, tell me everything you know about how Goss works," she said. "What he looks for, how he structures his assessments." Colter pulled the chair closer to the table and began to talk. The 8 weeks that followed were the hardest of Mabel's time in the valley, not because of any single crisis, but because of the sustained quality of the work. She and Colter went through the operations records systematically, not just the financial ledgers, but the production logs, the worker records, the correspondence with the mills, the maintenance records for equipment and buildings. She learned more about the timber trade in those 8 weeks than most people who worked in it learned in 2 years, because she was reading everything at once and holding it all in relation to everything else, which was how she had always learned not one thing at a time, but in patterns and systems, in the connections between things that individually told a partial story and collectively told the whole one. She also made mistakes, which she found frustrating and necessary in equal measure. The first significant one came in the 5th week, when she was preparing a supplementary analysis of the mill relationships and made an error in her calculation of the freight costs that ran through 3 pages of figures before she caught it. She found it at 11 at night by lamplight. When she went back to check a number that hadn't settled right in her memory, she sat with the corrected version and the incorrect version side by side, and felt the particular cold feeling of understanding how close she had come to presenting something wrong with the same confidence she'd brought to the 12-page document. She told Colter about it the next morning. He listened. He looked at the correction. "Does it change the conclusion?" "No, the conclusion holds, but the path to it was wrong for 3 pages. "Then fix the path," I did. "Last night," she paused. "I'm telling you because you should know. If I'm going to be in that room when Goss arrives, you need to know that I make errors." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. "Mabel, everyone makes errors. Not everyone presents those errors to territorial investment groups as support for a management strategy." "No," he said. But everyone who does good work makes errors in the process of doing it. The question is whether you catch them." He handed the corrected pages back to her. "You caught it." She took the pages. She was not entirely comforted, but she was somewhat comforted, and she went back to work. The valley's rhythms continued around and through the preparation. Spring moved into early summer, which meant the cutting operation expanded back toward full pace after the reduced winter schedule, and the compound filled with a level of activity and noise and general disorder that Mabel had not yet experienced in her months there. Timber crews came in from the cutting areas in the late afternoon with the accumulated dirt and exhaustion of physical work, and the kitchen ran from before dawn until after dark, and equipment needed attention, and disputes needed resolving, and the whole enterprise kept demanding things from Colter that had nothing to do with investment reviews or management assessments. Mabel watched how he handled it. She had thought of him in those first weeks as a controlled man, but she had begun to understand that control differently. It was not the control of a man suppressing his nature. It was the control of a man who had learned early that the people depending on him did not benefit from his uncertainty, and who had developed the habit of processing his own reactions privately so that what he presented externally was functional. Cost him something, she could see that now. In the occasional evening when he came to dinner later than usual and ate without speaking, or in the early mornings when she came downstairs and found him already at the work table at an hour that said he hadn't slept. She didn't push into those moments. She wasn't sure it was her place, and she wasn't sure he wanted her there. But she began leaving a lamp on in the main hall in the evenings when she went up to her room, because the dark lodge had a particular quality that she thought probably didn't help a man who was carrying as much as he was carrying, and a lit lamp cost nothing. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't expect him to. The second significant mistake of those 8 weeks wasn't Mabel's. It was Colter's, and it happened on a Wednesday in the 6th week, when he received a communication from Roderick through a mutual acquaintance in the lowland settlements. A social message that contained, embedded in its social language, an offer. Roderick would withdraw his challenge to the management structure if Colter agreed to modify the cutting schedule in 3 specific areas, a modification that would, Mabel calculated when Colter showed her the letter, increase output in those areas by approximately 22% over the next 4 years. Colter was considering it. She knew he was considering it because of the way he held the letter and the way he didn't talk about it for 2 days. On the evening of the 2nd day, she said, without preamble, "You're thinking about taking his offer." Dinner table. Colter looked at her. "I'm thinking about what ending this costs versus what continuing it costs." What does ending it cost? 3 sections of forest that I'd planned to let rest for another 2 seasons. What does continuing it cost? Time. Goss's visit. The investor's uncertainty for another several months while they wait for the report. He set down his fork. There's also the possibility that Goss sides with Roderick, regardless of what our records show. No, he was quiet, but it's possible. Mabel looked at him. If you give Roderick those 3 sections, you tell him that the right amount of pressure produces compromise. He'll be back in 2 years asking for more. I know that. You're not actually considering it then. He picked up his fork again. No, I needed to think through why I wasn't, and now I have. She understood that the need to hold an idea until you knew where it broke, and she let the subject close. It was in those weeks that something else shifted, more gradually and with less drama than anything else that had happened in the valley. Didn't have a specific moment she could point to afterward. It was the accumulation of evenings at the work table and corrections made and arguments tested, and the specific quality of working alongside someone who was serious about the same thing you were serious about. They disagreed sometimes. The first real argument came over the worker records, when Mabel identified what appeared to her to be a pattern of wage inconsistency between the long-term workers and the seasonal hires that she thought should be addressed in the Goss materials as evidence of fair management practices. Colter said the wage structure was standard for the territory. Mabel said standard, for the territory was not the same as fair, and that if Goss was going to evaluate the operations management holistically, she would rather that holistic view include evidence that the management cared about more than yield per acre. Colter said that introducing labor practices into a financial review was a distraction from the primary argument. Mabel said that a financial review of a long-term operation necessarily included the stability of the labor force, and that stability required wages that didn't make experienced workers leave for other operations. They argued for the better part of an hour. Neither of them raised their voice. The argument was substantive and specific, and entirely unresolved by the time Hester put her head in from the kitchen and said that if they were done talking, she'd appreciate someone banking the fire before they went up. They were not done talking. They continued the next morning. Colter came to it differently the second day. She could see that he had gone away and actually thought about what she'd said, not just reassembled his original position. He acknowledged that she was right about labor stability and its relationship to long-term operational value. He was less certain about raising wages as an immediate measure, because the financial position during Roderick's challenge was not the moment for additional operating costs. Mabel said she wasn't suggesting raising wages in the next 30 days. She was suggesting documenting the existing wage structure with context showing the tenure rates, the retention rates, the relationship between worker stability and production consistency. That, Colter agreed, was different from what he'd thought she was proposing. "You should have said that the first time," he said. "You should have asked what I meant before assuming you knew," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Fair." The section on labor and retention went into the Goss materials. Mabel wrote it in a single sitting and didn't revise it afterward, because it was the clearest things she'd written, and she knew when not to revise. Frederick Goss arrived in the valley on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. He was not what Mabel had expected, which was her fault for building an expectation. She had imagined a version of the Galt and Birch type professional, careful, readable in his professionalism. Goss was 60-something and small-framed, and wore a traveling coat that had seen as much use as Colter's canvas jacket. And he came off his horse and shook Colter's hand, and then looked at Mabel with a directness that was neither rude nor deferential, and said, "You must be Mrs. Wren. I've heard about you from Galt. Good things, I hope," she said. He said, "You were unexpected." Goss looked around the compound with the systematic gaze of someone who was already working. He meant it as a compliment. "I know," she said. He laughed a short, dry sound. "Good. Let's get started." Goss spent 3 days in the valley. He did not spend them the way Roderick had, moving through the lodge and the records, as though the conclusion were already reached, and the process was performance. Goss actually worked. He was in the records from before breakfast until the light was insufficient, and he asked questions that showed he had read what had been sent to him before arriving. And he walked the cutting areas with Colter for the better part of an entire day without appearing to tire. He was also, Mabel noted, watching her, not unpleasantly, but with the particular attention of someone who has been told a thing and is checking whether the thing matches the evidence. She let him watch. She had nothing to hide and no performance to maintain, which was its own kind of freedom. On the second evening, Goss found her at the desk in the office going through the labor records she'd been compiling. "You don't stop," he said. "Neither do you," she said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she respected. "Tell me something, Mrs. Wren. You came from Granger's Hollow." "Yes, poor settlement, small. Not much commerce." "That's right. So where did you learn to think like a business analyst?" Mabel considered the question. "I didn't," she said. "I learned to think like a woman who needed the numbers to make sense. The business part is just what the numbers happen to be about up here." Goss looked at her for a moment. "That's an interesting answer. Accurate. Most of the trained men I know in this field don't think in systems," he said. "They think in categories. Your document, the one you prepared for Galt's visit, thinks in systems. 18 years of records, forestry observation, labor patterns, regeneration rates, all in relation to each other." Mabel didn't say anything. "Is that how you naturally think?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Always been how I think. I just never had anything large enough before to apply it to." Goss nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding something. Roderick Wren is going to provide me with his own materials before I file my report, he said. He's arranged a meeting in Calverton next week. I know, she said. Colter had told her. His materials are going to be well prepared, Goss said. He's hired someone to present them. I expected that. Is there anything in your records that you think his presentation is going to misrepresent? Mabel looked at him. The regeneration data in sections 7 through 11. Those are the areas on rest rotation where the observable recovery is most advanced. Data there is unambiguous if you read it from the ground up. Becomes ambiguous if you start from a yield projection and work backward. Goss was quiet for a moment. Can you give me the ground-level observation logs for those sections? Can give you Colter's, she said. He documented them quarterly for 4 years. And I can give you James Wren's original baseline observations that established what recovery in those areas should look like. Do that, Goss said. She pulled the relevant journals from the shelf that night and made copies of the key entries in her own hand, not summaries, full transcriptions, because she wanted there to be no question about selection or omission. She worked past midnight. Her back hurt from the chair, and her hand cramped twice, and she made herself stop and flex it, and then kept going. She gave the copied documents to Goss at breakfast the next morning. He looked at the stack. When did you do this last night? He looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she expected from a professional's assessor. Mrs. Wren, he said, I've been doing this work for 22 years. I have never had anyone prepare materials for me at midnight the night before I leave. Are they useful? She said. Yes. Then it was worth it, she said, and went to help Hester with the meal. Goss left that afternoon. He shook Colter's hand for longer than necessary and then turned to Mabel's and said, I'll do an honest report. That's all I can promise you. That's all we need, she said. Colter stood beside her on the porch, and they watched the horses go, and the valley went back to its summer business around them. Now we wait, Colter said. Now we wait, she agreed. Waiting for Mabel meant continuing to work. She had spent enough of her life managing an anxiety that could not be resolved by the thing producing it, her father's illness, the debt numbers that didn't move, to understand that the only workable response to waiting was redirection. She redirected herself to the lodge's supply management, which she had been planning to overhaul since her second week in the valley, but had deferred for the more urgent materials. She spent 2 weeks reworking the storage system and the ordering schedule, which produced a conversation with Hester that began as a negotiation and arrived somewhere closer to collaboration. As Hester had been running the lodge household since James Wren's time, and she had systems of her own that were not written down and not obvious, and Mabel had the judgment to recognize that unwritten systems that had worked for years deserved investigation before replacement. She asked questions. She listened. She revised her plans in 3 places based on what Hester told her. At the end of the second week, Hester set a cup of coffee on the desk where Mabel was working and said, without ceremony, You're not what I expected. Mabel looked up. What did you expect? Hester considered this with the seriousness of someone who did not give incomplete answers. I expected someone Mr. Wren had chosen for practical reasons. Someone who would be in the way. I am someone he chose for practical reasons. Yes, Hester said, but you're not in the way. She picked up the empty tray. Dinner at 6. It was, Mabel understood, the closest thing to acceptance she was likely to get from Hester, and she received it accordingly. Roderick's next move came not as a letter but as a rumor, which was a different kind of thing, and is in some ways worse. The rumor reached the valley through Dix, who had gone to the lowland settlements for supplies and come back with provisions and information in roughly equal measure. He reported it to Colter without editorial. It was not Dix's habit to editorialize, which was that Roderick had been speaking to the mill operators in the lower settlements, and that what he'd been saying was not about cutting schedules or regeneration rates. What he'd been saying was about Mabel. The story Roderick was circulating was this, that Colter Wren, under the influence of a calculating woman from a poor settlement, had been talked into management decisions that were compromising the operation, and that the woman in question had married into the family with the specific intention of using her influence over Colter for her own financial gain. The phrase Dix reported with the slight discomfort of a man repeating something he found distasteful was a fat girl who knew which side her bread was buttered. Colter's face went through several things in rapid succession when Dix finished. He was not a man who typically broadcast his reactions, but this one moved through him visibly. Mabel said, "Thank you, Dix." Dix nodded and left the room. Colter said, "I'm going to—" "What?" she said. He stopped. "What are you going to do?" she said. Her voice was level. Cost her to keep it level, but she kept it level. "Ride down there and tell Roderick to stop saying things? That makes you look reactive, and it makes me look like someone who needs protection. He's attacking you specifically. He's been attacking me specifically since he walked into this lodge." She turned from the window she'd been looking out of. "But, Colter, I know what I look like to people like Roderick. I have known it since I was old enough to understand that other girls my age were being looked at differently than I was. He is not saying anything that hasn't been said or implied, suggested with a look, for most of my life." The anger in Colter's face was specific and controlled, but she could see the edges of it. "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No, it doesn't." She crossed her arms. "But what makes it a problem we can address is that it's not true. The Mills can say that to Goss. Roderick can say it in his report. And then Goss is going to read 18 years of ledgers and 4 years of observation logs and a 12-page analysis and a set of ground-level forestry records compiled at midnight, and he's going to have to write down what he found." Colter was quiet. "I am not nothing," she said, not with heat, just with the plainness of someone stating a fact that has been tested and found to hold. "I know I'm not nothing. You know I'm not nothing. The work knows it." She unfolded her arms. "Let the work speak." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the careful, assessing look of the first weeks. It was something more unguarded than that, and it sat on his face for only a moment before his control came back. "All right," he said. She went back to the supply records. But that night, lying in the room that had become her room, where her pencil books were stacked on the desk and her shawl hung on the hook behind the door, and the east-facing window showed her the cliff face going gray. In the evening light she let herself feel it in the way she had allowed herself 60 seconds behind Agnes Pruitt's dry goods, except that she didn't count this time. It wasn't about what Roderick had said. She had been honest with Colter. Those words weren't new. What sat heavier was the particular shape of what Roderick was doing, which was taking the thing she had worked hardest to separate from the judgment of her, worth her body, the shape she inhabited, the fact that she was not what the world called desirable, and using it as the central argument against everything she had built in this valley. She had always known that some people would never separate the container from the contents. She had learned over years not to require them to. She had learned that their failure to see her clearly was not her problem to solve. But the learning never made it stop hurting. She allowed herself the hurt for as long as it lasted, which was perhaps an hour. She did not try to cut it short or manage it into something more palatable. She sat with it in the dark and let it be what it was, which was legitimate and painful and not the end of anything. Then she lit the lamp and opened the pencil book and went back to work. The wait for Goss's report was 6 weeks. The letter came on a Thursday in September, and this time Mabel was in the office when Dix brought it in, and Colter opened it in front of her. He read it standing up. She watched his face. His face did not change much, but what it did was move in a direction she recognized by now, away from tension and toward something calmer, the way a man looks when a thing he has been braced against does not land. He handed her the letter. Goss's report to the investment group recommended continued management under Colter Wren, with no changes to the current cutting and regeneration program. It cited the comprehensive documentation of the operation's history, the soundness of the long-term sustainability projections, and what Goss called evidence of exceptionally rigorous management practice across all facets of the operation. There was a paragraph near the end of the letter that addressed Roderick's challenge, specifics characterizing the alternative proposal as financially coherent in the short term and strategically incoherent across the operation's life cycle. There was also a single sentence near the close, which read, "The materials prepared and presented by Mrs. Mabel Wren represent some of the most thorough and methodologically sound operational documentation I have encountered in 2 decades of assessment work." Mabel read that sentence twice. She put the letter down on the table. Colter was watching her. She picked up the letter and read that sentence a third time. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to be certain she had read it correctly the first 2 times. She had. She put the letter down again and was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said. "Yes," Colter said. She looked at the letter on the table, at all the weeks that letter represented, at the pencil books stacked on the shelf she'd brought them to from her room when the working space in the office became too necessary to commute to, the oil rings on the desk from the lamp that had burned past midnight more times than she could precisely count. "Does this settle it with Roderick?" she said. "With the investors, yes. With Roderick," Colter paused. "He won't be finished. He'll find a different avenue." "What avenue? I don't know yet." He sat down. "He still has relationships with the mill operators. He still has financial resources and a long memory." He looked at her. "But he doesn't have this review." Mabel nodded slowly. "Then we'll find out what avenue he chooses." "We," Colter said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that unguarded expression again, the one she had glimpsed weeks ago, and that he had not entirely retrieved from her since. "We," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When I came to your door in Granger's Hollow," he said, "I had thought about this for a long time. What kind of person I needed. I had specific requirements." He looked down at the table, then back at her. "I did not expect." He was not, she had learned, a man who ran out of words often. "Take your time," she said. "I did not expect to feel that what you were doing here was also what I was doing," he said. "Not just useful. The same." Mabel looked at him. She felt the thing he was trying to say land more accurately than his actual words, because she had felt it too, that specific quality of working alongside someone and recognizing, without having planned for it, that you were not working separately, that the gap that had been there in the beginning, the professional contractual, careful distance of 2 people who had agreed to something practical, had been filling in without either of them directing it to. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not say anything further, and she did not require him to. Outside, the valley was moving into its afternoon timber cruise, coming back from the slopes, smokes rising from the kitchen where Hester was managing dinner, the particular sound of the compound at work. Mabel had been in this valley for 5 months. She had arrived a stranger in a marriage of convenience, in a life she had not chosen for its own qualities, but for what it could provide to the people she loved. She had not expected to begin to love any of it on its own terms. She was beginning to. That evening she wrote a letter to her father, told him about the Goss report. She told him that the valley was coming out of summer and into the early cool of the mountain fall, and that the cliffs in the evening light turned a color she had no adequate word for, somewhere between gold and rust and gray. She told him she had learned more in 5 months than in the previous 5 years combined, which was the kind of learning that tired you in a good way. She told him she was well. She didn't tell him about the sentence at the end of Goss's letter, because some things were hard to explain without sounding like you were asking for something from the telling of them. She held that sentence privately, not as pride exactly, more as evidence, things she could point to internally when needed. She sealed the letter and went to find Dix to include it with the next supply run. In the hallway, she almost walked directly into Colter, who was coming from the direction of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and milk, and who stopped when he nearly ran into her and then held out one of the cups. "I was bringing this up," he said. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. "How did you know I was still awake?" she said. "The lamp in your room," he said. "It was still lit when I went to bank the fire." She took the cup. They stood for a moment in the hallway, with the lodge quiet around them, and the fall night cold outside the windows, and the particular stillness of a house full of sleeping people. "Colter," she said. "Yes, the arrangement we agreed to." She held the cup in both hands. "Put conditions on it." "I put conditions on it." "We both kept them." "Yes," he said. "I want to put a new condition on it," she said. He waited. "I want to stop calling it an arrangement," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The unguarded expression was fully there now, and he did not retrieve it. "All right," he said. "What do we call it instead?" Mabel thought about a girl who had stood in a collapsing cabin with nothing but numbers that didn't work, and 2 weeks and a stranger's offer. She thought about what she had done with that, and what it had turned into, and what was still turning. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'll think of something." She went back upstairs with the coffee. Behind her, she heard him laugh quiet and genuine in the empty hallway, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, and the sound of it followed her up the stairs and settled somewhere. She suspected it would stay. The fall came into the valley the way it always did at that elevation, not gradually, but in a single decisive week, when the temperature dropped 15 degrees and stayed there, and the light changed from the full yellow of summer to something thinner and more horizontal. And the timber crews started wearing their heavy coats to the cutting areas in the mornings, even when the afternoons warmed back to bearable. Mabel noticed the change in herself as much as in the landscape. Some things had settled in her that had not been settled before, not contentment exactly, because there was still too much unresolved for contentment, but a quality of knowing where she was that she hadn't possessed in those first disorienting weeks of spring. She knew the compound now. She knew its rhythms and its people and its particular problems, which recurring, and which seasonal and which chronic. She knew which workers were reliable under pressure and which needed management even in ordinary times. She knew where Hester kept the spare lamp oil and where the supply records were most likely to be inaccurate, and which section of the east barn roof was going to need attention before the winter snows. She knew the man she had married in ways that had nothing to do with what she had known of him in those first weeks, when he had been a controlled stranger in a patched coat whose intentions she could not read. She still couldn't always read him. But the inability had changed its quality. It was less the opacity of someone unknown and more the depth of someone complex, which was a different problem, and one she found herself considerably less bothered by. They were not a conventional married couple. They had arrived at each other from too many practical angles and with too many explicit agreements on the table for conventional to be an available category. What they were was harder to name but clearer in practice. Two people who had found that the working relationship they'd contracted for had produced something else alongside it, something that neither had planned for and neither appeared to be in a hurry to define aloud. Mabel was comfortable with things she couldn't define. She had spent most of her life navigating situations that didn't have clean names. She was less comfortable with the particular quality of Colter's attention when he was watching her think through a problem, which had started happening more frequently and which produced in her a self-consciousness she found both inconvenient and quietly not entirely unwelcome. She did not mention this in the pencil book. Some things were better kept out of the record. The letter from Clara Beaumont arrived in October, 3 weeks after the Goss report had effectively closed Roderick's formal challenge to the management structure. Came with the regular correspondence, unremarkable in its envelope, addressed to Mrs. Mabel Rowan in a handwriting that was assured and slightly compressed, the hand of someone who wrote a great deal and had no patience for ornamentation. Mabel read it at the office desk, while Colter was out with the timber crews, checking on the fall cutting schedule. Clara Beaumont was a name she did not know, but the letter described her clearly enough. A woman of approximately 50 who had operated in the territorial mining investment sector for 20 years, initially through her late husband's interests and then in her own, right after his death 8 years prior. She had heard about the Goss review through Galt, who was apparently a mutual acquaintance. She had read Goss's report, including the sentence about Mabel's documentation. She was writing to request a meeting. The proposed meeting was not social. Beaumont was considering an investment in a mid-size mining operation in the Northern Territory and was, in her own words, dissatisfied with the quality of analysis she had received from the men she had hired for the purpose. She had a specific question: would Mrs. Wren be willing to review the operation's records and provide an independent assessment of its long-term resource management practices? She would, she noted, pay for this service. Mabel read the letter twice. She set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, and then picked it up and read it a third time. She was still holding it when Colter came in from the yard, cold from the morning air, pulling off his work gloves. He looked at her face and then at the letter. "What is it?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it standing up. The way he read anything, he was processing quickly. His expression as he read was the careful, neutral look she had learned, meant he was thinking rather than reacting. He handed it back. "What do you want to do?" "I want to meet with her," Mabel said. "Then you should." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's a distraction from the work here, is it?" She considered. "It would take a week, 2 at the outside, depending on the records. The operation can manage 2 weeks without your supply records," he said, with what she had come to recognize as his version of dry humor, which was so dry. It was almost indistinguishable from a plain statement of fact. She almost smiled. "Clara Beaumont is significant in the mining sector," she said. "An association with her work would—" "Mabel." He put his gloves on the table. "You don't need to justify it to me. It's your work. The agreement we made covers this." She looked at him for a moment. The agreement. It had become a strange thing to reference. That agreement, it had been the structure they'd built everything else on, and what they'd built had become so much larger than the structure, that the structure itself now felt like the smallest part of it. "I know," she said. "I'm not justifying it. I'm thinking out loud." "Then think out loud," he said. She thought out loud, which in practice meant she talked through it for 20 minutes, while Colter made coffee and listened, and asked 2 specific questions and made no attempt to steer toward a conclusion. It was one of the things she had come to rely on about him, that he did not confuse listening with managing, and did not feel required to produce an answer to a question she hadn't asked him. She wrote back to Clara Beaumont that afternoon and agreed to the meeting. Beaumont came to the valley, rather than requiring Mabel to travel to her, which was the first indication that she was a woman who understood something about the nature of respect. She arrived on a Friday in late October, with 2 men who were clearly staff rather than companions, and she came off her horse with the ease of someone who spent considerable time in rough territory and had no feelings about it either way. She was not what the word investor typically produced in Mabel's mind, which was some version of Galt or Birch, or the men from Granger's Hollow's grain exchange, who talked about money in the tones reserved for sacred subjects. Beaumont was compact and direct, and had a face that had been weathered by weather, not by age, and she shook Mabel's hand with the grip of someone who had learned that a firm handshake from a woman was still remarkable enough to be useful. "Mrs. Wren," she said, "thank you for agreeing to this." "Come inside," Mabel said. "I've got coffee." Over the first hour, while the 2 staff members settled in the bunkhouse, and Colter handled the introductory courtesies of hosting, Mabel and Clara Beaumont conducted an assessment of each other that was entirely mutual and entirely unacknowledged. Beaumont asked questions that were more precise than they sounded. Mabel answered them with equivalent precision. By the end of the coffee, they had established between them the particular shorthand of 2 people who think at similar speeds and do not need things explained twice. Beaumont brought the mining operation records with her. They were not in good order, not because they were fraudulent, Mabel thought, but because whoever had maintained them had prioritized production, tracking, over the kind of longitudinal documentation that made long-term assessment possible. There were numbers, but the numbers were not in conversation with each other. Their output data without the corresponding input data that gave output its meaning. There were assay records without the geological surveys that contextualized them. Mabel looked at the records and thought about the timber ledgers she had gone through in April and felt the particular engagement that came from a problem that was real and specific and could be approached from multiple angles. "How long do I have?" she asked. "I need a recommendation before the end of the month," Beaumont said. "The investment window closes after that. 3 weeks. More or less," Mabel considered. "I'll need the assay records going back at least 5 years. What you've given me only goes back 2. I can have them by Wednesday. And I'll need the original land survey, not just the production zone maps." Beaumont made a note. "Done. And I want to talk to someone who's worked the operation from the ground level. Not management. A worker, if possible, someone who's been there long enough to have seen the production cycle change." Beaumont looked at her with something that was not surprise, but was adjacent to appreciation. "I can arrange that." The 3 weeks were harder in a different way than the 8 weeks before the Goss review. The timber work had been a matter of learning a language she hadn't spoken before learning enough to read an 18-year record and reconstruct the argument it contained. The mining work was a different language entirely, and she was learning it from records that were imperfect sources and a supplementary conversation with a 40-year-old man named Pete Carver, who had worked the operation's shafts for 11 years and who was initially suspicious of her. Questions, and then as the conversation went on, less so. She made more mistakes with the mining records than she had with the timber records, and she caught most, but not all of them, before Colter found one in the 3rd week. While reviewing her draft, he had done enough reading of mining operations in the territory to spot an error in her extraction rate, calculation that she had carried across 4 pages. She was angry about it. Not at him, at herself, at the error. "Fixable," he said. "I know it's fixable. I'm angry because I should have caught it. You caught 9 other errors in this draft. This one I missed." He looked at her steadily. "Mabel, you've been working with records that are partially disorganized in a sector you've never analyzed before, with a 3-week deadline. One carried error in 18 pages is not a failure. It would have been in my recommendation to Beaumont. Yes, and it won't be, because you have someone reviewing it." He paused. "Why 2 people are better than 1. She took the corrected pages back to the desk. She fixed the error and then went back through the entire document from the beginning to check for any others she might have missed, which took until 2 in the morning, but which she did not consider optional. There were no others. She gave the final document to Beaumont on a Thursday morning, with the particular feeling of someone handing over something they are reasonably confident in, but cannot entirely protect the uncertainty of work that would be evaluated by someone else's judgment and in circumstances she couldn't fully anticipate. Beaumont read it in the lodge's main room over the course of 2 hours. Mabel did not watch. She went and helped Hester with the bread and tried not to think about what Beaumont was reading and largely failed. When Beaumont came into the kitchen, Hester looked at her and then looked at Mabel and then removed herself with the tact of someone who had been managing a household of complicated people for a long time. Beaumont sat down at the kitchen table. "The operation has a viable 10-year window," she said. "After that, the primary seam productivity drops significantly, and the secondary seams require a different extraction approach that would need substantial capital investment." "Yes," Mabel said. "Your recommendation is a modified investment enter at current valuation. Establish a cap on the investment horizon. Plan for an exit before the 10-year transition." Beaumont looked at her. "Conservative." "It's accurate," Mabel said. "A more optimistic reading of the secondary seam data would support a longer investment horizon. A more optimistic reading of that data would require ignoring Pete Carver's account of how the secondary seam production has behaved over the last 3 years," Mabel said, "which I wasn't willing to do." Beaumont was quiet for a moment. "Most analysts I've worked with would have taken the more optimistic number. It's an easier recommendation to defend in the short term. I know, Mabel said. I'm not interested in short-term defensibility. Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. It was the same look Goss had given her at the end of his 3 days in the valley, something like recognition, which was different from approval and more useful. Mrs. Wren, Beaumont said, how would you feel about a more formal arrangement? Mabel put down the bread she'd been slicing. Define formal. I evaluate 3 to 5 operations per year, Beaumont said. Historically, I've used 2 analysts in the territorial capital, both of whom are competent and neither of whom thinks in the way your documents demonstrate. I'm not suggesting you leave this valley. I'm suggesting a consulting arrangement. I bring you the records. You provide analysis. We agree on terms and compensation. She paused. Case-by-case basis to start. If it works, we revisit the structure. Mabel looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She thought about the pencil book in her room, where the numbers had started as her family's catastrophe and had grown into something else entirely, a way of seeing, a way of holding things in relation to each other, a way of asking what the full story was when the incomplete story was the one being presented. She thought about Granger's Hollow. She thought about Harlan Briggs's face, and Agnes Pruitt's careful pleasure, and the specific quality of being assessed and found lacking by people who never looked past the assessment. She thought about Pete Carver, who had answered her questions with growing seriousness because she had asked them seriously, and who had told her things about the operation's geological behavior that had changed 2 of her early conclusions because she had been willing to revise. What are the terms? She said. They negotiated for 40 minutes at the kitchen table over Hester's bread and the remains of the morning coffee. Beaumont was a precise negotiator. She made offers that were fair without being generous, which Mabel respected more than generosity, because generosity in a first negotiation was a form of positioning. She countered twice, accepted once, and they arrived at something both of them could work with. When Colter came in from the yard an hour later, Mabel and Clara Beaumont were still at the table, talking not about the terms anymore, but about a second operation. Beaumont was tracking in the Southern Territory, silver mining concern with a complicated ownership structure. He looked at the 2 of them. He looked at Mabel's face. He poured himself coffee and sat down and said, "Should I come back later?" "No," Mabel said. "Clara, this is my husband. He's been reviewing my work for the past 3 weeks, and he caught the extraction rate error in the 3rd week, so you can factor in the quality of his technical reading." Beaumont looked at Colter with new attention. "Mr. Wren, Mrs. Beaumont," he said, "I've heard of your work in the northern mining sector, and I've read your operation's sustainability documentation," she said. "Your methodology is sound." "My wife's presentation of it was sounder," he said. Beaumont glanced at Mabel. "Yes," she said. "I gathered." Mabel looked at her coffee cup so that neither of them would see her expression. Clara Beaumont left the valley on Saturday morning with the assessment document and the consulting agreement, and what appeared to be a genuine regard for the valley's coffee, which she mentioned twice. She told Mabel she would be in touch within the month about the Southern Territory operation. After the horses disappeared, around the first bend of the trail, Mabel stood on the porch in the fall air and felt the particular quiet that followed people leaving, not loneliness, but the reassertion of ordinary life after an intensive period. Colter stood beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Consulting work," he said. "With Clara Beaumont." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. "My father knew her," he said. "He mentioned her once. He said she was the sharpest commercial mind in the territory." Mabel looked at the trail where the horses had gone. "Going to push me," she said. "She's not going to accept work that isn't right." "No," he agreed. "She won't." "Good," Mabel said. She went inside. She had supply records to update, and a letter to write to her father, and a new set of notes to begin on what she had learned from the mining sector work that she did not want to lose before she could use it again. The winter came with the seriousness that mountain winters always had, arriving not as a gradual cooling but as a week in November that dumped 3 feet of snow in 4 days. and closed the trails and compressed the compound into its winter configuration, reduced cutting operation, full focus on maintenance and supply management, and the particular project of keeping 30-odd people functional and purposeful through the months when the mountain made the outside world effectively inaccessible. Mabel had known intellectually that the valley's winters were isolating. She had not known it physically until the snow closed the trails and the world contracted to the compound's boundaries. And she understood that there was nowhere to go, and nothing coming in and nothing going out, for stretches that could run to 6 weeks at a time. The first week of that reality was harder than she'd expected. It wasn't the isolation that was hard. She had spent most of her life in relatively sparse company and was comfortable with her own thoughts in a way that made isolation less frightening than it was for some people. What was hard was the concentration of it. Every tension in the compound had nowhere to go. Every difficulty stayed inside the perimeter until it was addressed or until it festered into something larger. The workers, most of whom were decent enough people individually, produced in their winter concentration a friction that had not been visible in the summer's more distributed activity. She noticed it first in the food situation, which was the most immediate pressure point. The supply inventory she had reorganized in September showed sufficient stores for the winters. She had been precise about that, but the distribution of what was available required management that had not, she discovered, been systematically done in previous winters. The result was that certain items were being consumed ahead of schedule while others were being underused, and the imbalance was producing complaints among the workers that were nominally about food, but were actually about the quality of the management's attention to their daily conditions. She fixed the distribution schedule. That was the easy part. The harder part was the interpersonal friction, which she addressed in ways she had not entirely planned for in advance. She organized evening work practical skills that kept hands and minds busy in the long indoor hours. She made herself available for the kind of conversation that the workers would not bring to Colter directly, not because he was unapproachable, but because he was the employer, and the distance that entailed was real. She was not fully inside that distance, which made her a different kind of resource. A man named Horton, who was one of the longer-tenured workers, came to her in December with a complaint about another worker that was clearly a proxy for a longer-running dispute. She listened to the full account of it, asked the questions that needed asking, and then told him plainly that she was going to talk to both men separately and that she expected the dispute to be functional, if not resolved, by the end of the week. It was functional by the end of the week. Not resolved these things, rarely resolved, but functional. Colter watched her managing the winter compound with the same careful attention he had given her work from the beginning. He did not involve himself in things she was handling. He did not second-check her decisions or revise them after the fact. When she came to him with something she genuinely needed him for, he was there. Otherwise, he trusted her judgment and let it operate. She noticed this. She thought about it in the evenings when the compound was settled, and she was at the desk in the room that was now thoroughly her room walls marked by her pencil book stacks and her notes and her particular way of organizing things. Trust was not something she had taken for granted since she was old enough to understand that other people's trust in her was conditional on things she hadn't chosen: her size, her poverty, her lack of the credentials that made trust feel safe to extend. Colter's trust was not conditional in that way. It was based on evidence she had actually produced, and that specificity made it different. She wrote in the pencil book, "He trusts the work. The work is mine. Therefore, he trusts me. This is a different thing from what I've had before." She looked at that for a while. Then she wrote, "I trust him too. I should tell him that." She did not immediately tell him that. The Roderick situation resurfaced in January, which was both predictable and tiresome in its predictability. The specifics were different from the fall's formal challenge. Roderick had apparently accepted, or at least acknowledged, that the Goss report had closed the investment group avenue. What he had done instead was work-the-mill relationships, the same relationships that Colter had described back in April as Roderick's strongest remaining leverage point. He had, over the months since his failed management challenge, been quietly suggesting to the territory's mill operators that the Wren operation's sustainable cutting practices were producing supply inconsistencies that made it a less reliable partner than operations with more straightforward extraction schedules. The suggestion was not entirely without basis. Sustainable rotation did produce some variability in output by area, even though the overall production was consistent. Roderick was taking that variability and framing it as unreliability, which was a different thing, but could look similar from a certain angle. The news came through Dix, again, who had gone down to the lowland settlements for the midwinter supply run and come back with information as well as provisions. 2 of the 3 mill operators had mentioned variations of Roderick's framing in casual conversation. Neither had said anything direct. They were businessmen, and businessmen did not make direct accusations in casual conversation when they could make implications instead. But the implications were clear enough. Mabel read Dix's account of it and thought about it for 2 days before saying anything to Colter. When she told him, he was quiet for a longer time than she expected. "He's not going to stop," Colter said finally. "No," she said, "he's not. The mill relationships matter. If 2 of them start moving their contracts toward other operations, the production model takes a hit that takes years to recover from." I know. She had already been thinking about this. Problem is that we can demonstrate the production consistency from the records. But the records don't reach the mill operators directly. They reach Goss. They reach the investment group people who are formally reviewing us. The mill operators are getting Roderick's version over drinks and supply meetings. "Yes, we need a different kind of document," she said. "Not a formal assessment. Something that puts the production data in a form that a mill operator reads in the course of normal business. Something that arrives on their desk as useful information rather than as a rebuttal." Colter looked at her. "A supply report. Quarterly," she said, "covering actual output by area, projected output for the next quarter, and the relationship between the rotation schedule and the consistency of supply. Not defensive, just informative. Information that happens to answer the question Roderick is raising without appearing to answer it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to write it." "I've already started," she said. "I started thinking about the structure 2 days ago." He looked at her with that expression, the unguarded one. "You knew you were going to propose this before you came to me." "I was going to propose it regardless," she said. "I came to you because the mill relationships are yours, and the decision about how to approach them should be made together." "Together," he said. "That's the arrangement," she said. "I thought we weren't calling it an arrangement anymore." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, but there was something in his face that was not entirely serious. She had learned to track both at once. "That's the partnership," she corrected. Quarterly supply report took her a week to draft, and another 3 days to revise to her own satisfaction. It was not a long document. She understood that mill operators were not going to read long documents out of goodwill, and that the art of useful communication was making the important information unavoidable, rather than comprehensive. 8 pages. Clean tables showing output by section, the rotation schedule and its relationship to overall supply. 4 quarters of historical data that demonstrated consistency at the operation level, even where individual sections varied. She did not mention Roderick. She did not appear to rebut anything. She was providing useful information, which happened to make the implication of unreliability arithmetically impossible to sustain. Colter reviewed it. He made 2 suggestions, both of which improved the document. She incorporated them. She sent it to all 3 mill operators with a cover note that was warm, without being ingratiating and professional, without being cold a balance. She had been practicing since her first month in the valley, and still sometimes did not quite hit. Responses came back over the following 3 weeks. All 3 mill operators acknowledged receipt. Two asked follow-up questions that gave Mabel the opportunity to provide additional context. The third, the one who had been most receptive to Roderick's suggestions, according to Dix, did not respond immediately, which she noted and did not rush. He responded in February, when the supply report for the second quarter was already being prepared. His letter was brief and businesslike and indicated that he was interested in extending the operation's current supply contract for an additional 2 years. Mabel read that letter and then set it down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and found Colter in the barn where he was overseeing a repair on one of the wagons, and she told him. He set down the tool he was holding. He looked at her. The controlled expression he wore around the workers, and in formal situations, was not entirely present, and what was underneath it was something uncomplicated, the clean relief of someone who had been carrying a weight and felt it lift. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "You knew the mill relationship. I knew the document, Mabel." Colter. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold barn, with the winter light coming thin through the gaps in the wall planks, and the sound of the workers continuing the wagon repair around them. Something was moving toward a surface that had been approaching that surface for months, and they were both aware of it. A worker called out a question about the wheel fitting. Colter answered it, without looking away from her, for a full moment first, and then he looked at the worker and answered the question in a steady voice, and the moment folded back into the ordinary. It had been there. Walking back to the lodge, Mabel thought about the pencil book entry she had written in December. Trust him, too. I should tell him that. She had not yet told him. Working on the timing. March came with the particular hope of late mountain winter, the snow still deep, but the light beginning to strengthen. The days, incrementally longer, cold losing its absolute quality, and admitting occasional afternoons that felt like reminders that the season was not permanent. The compound responded to this the way it responded. Every year, Hester told her, with a restlessness that was almost physical, as though 30 people and the buildings containing them were all leaning slightly toward the coming warmth. Mabel's received 2 things in March that changed the shape of what came next. The first was a letter from Clara Beaumont with the materials on the Southern Territory silver operation, as promised. It was a more complex situation than the mining assessment from the fall multiple partial ownership stakes, a complicated water rights question, and a production history that showed 3 distinct operational phases that needed to be separated to be read correctly. Mabel read through the preliminary materials and felt the particular engagement of a problem that was real and difficult and addressable, and began making notes. The second was a letter from her father. Thomas Rowan's letters had been coming with the regular correspondence. All winter short letters. Thomas was not a writer, but consistent. He reported on his health, which the Harlan County doctor's treatments had measurably stabilized. He reported on the neighbor woman who was managing the cabin. He asked careful questions about the valley that showed he was paying attention to what Mabel wrote to him. This letter was different. He wrote that he was well enough to travel for the first time in 2 years, if travel was short distances. He wrote that Dr. Hale in Harlan County had confirmed it. He wrote in the careful way he had of saying things sideways, when they were important to him, that he had been thinking about the valley, and about the description of the cliff face at evening, and about the particular sound she had described of the timber crews coming back at the end of the day, and that he thought he would very much like to see it for himself before he ran out of time for seeing new things. Mabel held that letter for a long time. Then she went to find Colter. He was in the office, and he looked up when she came in, and she handed him the letter without explaining it, because the explanation was in the reading. He read it. He looked up. When can he travel? She felt something in her chest that was too large and too specific to be named easily. Hale says spring. Once the mountain weather is clear enough to make the trail manageable. Send Dix down in April to escort him up, Colter said, with the supply wagon, not on horseback. It'll take longer, but it's easier on a man who's been ill. She looked at him. You don't have to. He's your father, Colter said. That means he's family. He said it without ceremony. The way he said things that were settled in his own mind and did not require performance. We have the room. We have the medical resources here that are better than what he has in the cabin. And Hester has been complaining for 2 years that this lodge is wasted on people who don't appreciate the kitchen. Mabel looked at him. He looked at her. Colter, she said. Yes, I trust you, she said. I should have said that a long time ago, and I didn't say it because I was still checking, and I'm done checking. She held his gaze. Trust you. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered whether she had misjudged the moment, which was possible. She had misjudged moments before. Then he said, I know, very quietly. I've known for a while. Then you should have told me you knew. I was waiting for you to say it. She looked at him. That's an inefficient system. Yes, he said. I know. He was looking at her with the fully unguarded expression, and its stayed this time didn't fold back into the controlled look. She thought about a mountain trapper on her family's porch in a patched canvas coat who had said, I'll be plain, and how far that had traveled from the porch in Granger's Hollow to this office in this valley on this March morning. She had not been saved. She had made a decision and worked and learned and made errors and corrected them and worked again. And what she was standing in was the result of all of that imperfect, complicated, this genuinely hers. Outside the office window, the valley was beginning its slow return from winter. Snow still on the ground, but the creek running clear again, where it had been sluggish and half-frozen for months. The timber crews would be back to full schedule within weeks. The supply correspondence was waiting on the desk. Clara Beaumont's silver operation records were waiting in the leather satchel. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But first, Mabel Wren stood in the office of the lodge that had become her lodge in the valley that had become her valley, and she let herself be where she was, without immediately moving toward what came next, because some moments deserved their full duration, and she was learning slowly and imperfectly to let them have it. Thomas Rowan arrived in the valley on a Thursday in late April, in the back of the supply wagon with 2 blankets across his lap and his old hat on his head, and his eyes wide open the entire last hour of the trail. Dix had done exactly what Colter had said he would do, taken the longer route, the wagon route, the one that added a day and a half to the journey, but didn't require a sick man to manage a mountain horse. He had also, the sade of by Dix's undemonstrative standards, apparently taken considerable care of Thomas along the way, because Thomas arrived not depleted but alert, with the look of a man who had been paying attention to everything he passed and was not yet finished paying attention. Mabel was in the yard when the wagon came through. She had told herself she would not stand there waiting like someone who had been watching the trail all morning, and then she had stood there watching the trail all morning. Because some things you tell yourself are aspirational rather than accurate. When she saw her father's face over the side panel thinner than she remembered, the illness had taken something permanent from his frame. But his eyes, the same dark, steady eyes she had looked into her entire life, something in her chest did the thing it did when relief arrived. After a fear you had been carrying long enough to stop recognizing it as fear, helped him down from the wagon. He was lighter than she expected, and tried not to show that he needed the help, which was entirely his character, and she didn't comment on it. He stood in the yard of the compound and looked at the lodge, and the barns, and the cliff walls rising beyond the tree line, and the creek running silver in the spring light, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Well, he said finally. I know, she said. He looked at her. You didn't tell me it was this. I tried to describe it. You described the cliff face at evening, he said. You did not describe the rest of it. The rest of it is harder to describe. He put his hand on her arm briefly, in the way he had always done when words were not the right instrument, put her hand over his. Colter came from the direction of the barn and shook Thomas's hand and said that the room was ready and that Dr. Hale's instructions had been passed to the valley's own medical resources, and that he was glad Thomas had not made the journey. He said it in the direct, plain way. He said things that he meant, without the performance of hospitality, and Thomas looked at him with the assessing look of a father who has been wondering about a man his daughter married and is now doing the actual assessment. Whatever Thomas found in the assessment appeared to satisfy him. He nodded once, with the economy of a man who did not make more of gestures than they required. "Thank you," Thomas said, "for the care of her." Colter glanced at Mabel briefly. "She hasn't needed much caring for," he said. "She's managed most of it herself." Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Yes," he said, "that's her." The spring that followed Thomas's arrival was the fullest the valley had been since Mabel came to it. Not in numbers, the worker population was roughly the same, but in something less quantifiable. A quality of completion that she could feel but couldn't have precisely explained. Her father in the yard in the afternoons, sitting in the chair that Hester had positioned to catch the best of the spring sun, watching the compound with the unhurried attention of a man who has been given something he didn't expect to have. Colter working the operation into its spring expansion, with the focused competence that was simply his nature. The timber crews back to full schedule, the sound of the operation returning to the compound's daily rhythm after winter's compressed quiet. And through all of it, Mabel working. The silver operation analysis for Clara Beaumont took 6 weeks longer than the mining assessment, because the water rights question required research into territorial legal frameworks that she had not previously encountered, and had to build understanding of from the ground up. She made errors. She corrected them. She sent a preliminary summary to Beaumont in the 5th week, and received back a set of precise questions that showed Beaumont had read every word and found the 2 places where Mabel's argument was weakest. She shored up both places and submitted the final assessment at the end of the 6th week. Beaumont's response was 2 days later. The assessment confirmed what Beaumont had suspected. The water rights situation made the operation's long-term viability conditional on a legal resolution that was not guaranteed. She was declining the investment. The assessment, she wrote, had saved her from a significant commitment to an uncertain asset, which was precisely the function she had engaged Mabel to perform. She enclosed a banker's draft for the agreed consulting fee. Mabel held the draft for a moment. It was the first money she had earned independently, not the household management of the valley, which was part of the partnership's shared enterprise, but money paid directly to her for work she had done with her own mind from her own knowledge. The amount was more than her family's original debt to Harlan Briggs. The comparison was not something she dwelled on, but she noticed it, because she was a person who noticed numbers and their relationships. She put the draft in the pencil book and wrote a letter to Beaumont, confirming receipt and expressing her readiness for the next assessment when it came. Roderick's final move came in June, and it came not as a business challenge, but as a legal one, which was both more serious and, in a way that Mabel had not expected, more clarifying. He had apparently spent the winter working with a territorial lawyer to construct a claim that James Wren's original will had been improperly executed, a technical argument about witnessing requirements that, if sustained, would have reopened the inheritance question and potentially given Roderick grounds to claim a share of the operation. Claim was delivered through a formal legal notice that arrived with the June correspondence. Colter read it and was quiet for a very long time. Mabel read it after him. She went through it twice and then sat back and thought about it with the specific focus she had learned to bring to problems that had multiple components operating at different levels simultaneously. "He's not going to win this," she said. "Probably not," Colter said, "but it has to be answered. That means lawyers and time and money. And while it's being answered, he gets to create the impression that the inheritance itself is uncertain," she said, "which is what he actually wants. Not the legal outcome, the uncertainty." Colter looked at her. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. "I want to write to Frederick Goss." He waited. "Not about the legal claim directly," she said, "about the operation's history. Goss spent 3 days here. He read 18 years of records. He understands what James Wren built and how he built it and what his intentions were for it." She looked at the legal notice on the table. A man's intentions for his life's work are relevant to how his will is read. and Goss's professional account of what the records show, about the operational continuity, about the transition, about the management philosophy that runs consistent from father to son, is evidence that a court would take seriously. Colter looked at the notice. He looked at her. You think Goss would do that? I think Goss does honest work, she said. I think the honest account of this operation supports James Wren's intentions clearly, and I think Goss knows that because he spent 3 days reading the evidence of it. She wrote to Goss that afternoon. The letter was not long. She explained the situation plainly and asked plainly whether he would be willing to provide a professional statement regarding the operation's history and the consistency of its management. Philosophy across the transition from James to Colter. Goss replied within the week. He would provide the statement, he said, in his characteristic dry way, that he had been wondering when Roderick Wren would try a different avenue, and that he was not surprised by this one. The legal challenge took 4 months to resolve, which was 4 months of lawyers and correspondence and the specific anxiety of a threat that moved slowly. Mabel did not enjoy those 4 months. She was honest with herself about the fact that she did not enjoy them. She had never been interested in pretending that difficult things were fine. She carried the tension of it the way she carried most difficult things, which was in the body rather than in the expressions she wore around other people. Colter noticed. He said nothing about it directly, but in the evenings, when the tension was most visible in her, he had a habit of finding a reason to be in whatever room she was in, not intruding, not requiring conversation, simply present. She had learned what that was worth. The claim was dismissed in October. The territorial court found no basis for the witnessing challenge. Roderick's lawyer apparently advised him that further legal avenues were not viable. The letter, informing them of the dismissal, arrived on a Wednesday. Mabel read it at the desk in the office, and then carried it to the kitchen, where Colter was having coffee with Thomas, who had become a fixture of the kitchen mornings. Thomas and Colter had developed a quiet companionship that had not been designed and was better for it. Two men who both preferred plain conversation and had enough plain things to talk about that they could sit together without effort. She set the letter on the table between them. They both read it. Thomas looked up first. "Is it finished?" "It's finished," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at Colter. "Your father built something worth fighting for," he said. "Means something." Colter looked at the letter, and then at Thomas, and then at Mabel. He had help defending it, he said. Thomas made the not-quite-law sound again. "Yes," he said, he did. What happened after the legal challenge ended was not a dramatic transformation. Life in the valley did not suddenly become uncomplicated. The operation had its difficulties: a bad storm in November that took out a section of the east barn roof, a dispute with a mill operator over a delivery schedule, a winter that was harder than the previous one. Thomas's health remained stable but not improving, and the stability was its own kind of management monitoring, adjusting, accepting the limits of what medicine could and couldn't do. But Roderick did not surface again. Whatever calculation he had been running for 3 years, the one that said the right pressure applied in the right place would eventually dislodge Colter and deliver the operation to him, had apparently reached a conclusion. The conclusion appeared to be that the pressure was not going to work, that the woman he had tried to dismiss as a mountain girl with no right to be in those rooms had turned out to be the thing he had least prepared for, which was someone who didn't need his permission to be competent. Mabel was not gracious about this in her private thoughts. She was human about it, which meant she felt the satisfaction of it more than she would have admitted publicly, and then she set it down and kept working. Because satisfaction in a completed battle was reasonable and useful only to the extent that it didn't distract from the ongoing work. The consulting arrangement with Clara Beaumont grew. By the following year, it was a regular practice, 4 assessments annually, a small office in the valley dedicated to the purpose, and a working relationship with Beaumont that had become something that was not precisely friendship, but was more than professional regard. Beaumont was a difficult person, in some ways demanding, sparing with approval, intolerant of imprecision, and Mabel found she did not mind any of it, because the difficulty was honest, and the standard was one she was capable of meeting. She wrote, eventually, not business documents, but something more durable, a practical guide to long-term resource management in frontier operations, drawn from the timber and mining work and the principles she had developed across both. It was not a long book. She had learned from years of writing documents that the right length was whatever the argument required and no more. She sent it to a territorial press in the capital on the advice of Beaumont, who had read the manuscript and said, in her precise way, that it contained ideas that people in this territory needed and didn't have access to. Press published it. The response was not immediate or dramatic, it never was, with practical books. But it moved through the territory's mining and timber and ranching communities over the following years, and produced gradually the particular effect of useful ideas in the hands of people who needed them. She dedicated it to Thomas Rowan, who had taught her that numbers told stories, and to the valley, which had given her room to learn what stories were worth telling. Thomas died in the spring of the third year, peacefully, and in the room that had become his room in the lodge, with the east-facing window that showed the cliff face he had wanted to see. Mabel had been there, so had Colter. She grieved her father with the fullness that grief required, and did not try to manage it into something smaller than it was. She had learned enough about carrying weight to know that trying to lighten it prematurely only made it heavier later. She planted a garden near the creek, in the spot where Thomas had liked to sit in the afternoons. She maintained it every year. It was impractical, more work than the valley's kitchen garden needed, but it was hers in a way that had nothing to do with utility, and she kept it. Standing on the lodge porch years later, on a September evening, when the light was doing the thing she had never found an adequate word for the cliff face and going between gold and rust, and Gray Mabel Wren thought about a girl who had stood in a cabin with impossible numbers on a page, and a stranger's offer on the table, and 60 seconds' worth of courage gathered behind a dry goods building, in a settlement that had measured her against everything she wasn't. She thought about what that girl had done with the offer. She had not been rescued by it. She had not been completed by it, or saved by it, or made into something she hadn't been before. The capacity had always been in her, the systematic thinking, the willingness to stay with a problem until it broke, the refusal to accept the measurement of people who could not see past the measuring. The offer had simply put her in a place large enough to use what she had. That was the thing that Granger's Hollow had never understood, and that she had not fully understood herself until the valley taught her. The problem had never been what she was. The problem had been the size of the available space. Found a larger space. She had worked in it. She had built things in it that were still standing. Colter came out from inside and stood beside her. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, which, after years together, was simply the texture of their days, the accumulated knowledge of a person's patterns and preferences that built up. So gradually you couldn't point to when it had happened, only observe that it had. Clara's assessment came back, he said. The copper operation? Viable, she says, with the modifications you suggested. Mabel wrapped her hands around the cup. Below them, the valley was settling into evening, the timber crews back, the cook fire going in the kitchen, the particular sound of the compound that she knew now, the way she knew her own breathing. I'll write back to her tomorrow, she said. They stood together in the cooling air. He was not a man who needed to fill silences, which remained one of the things she was most grateful for in him, not the wealth, not the protection, not even the trust, though all of those had mattered. The willingness to stand beside her and let her be where she was. She thought about the question Goss had asked her in this very valley, years ago. Is that how you naturally think? Yes, she had said. It's always been how I think. I just never had anything large enough before to apply it to. She had found the thing large enough. She had applied herself to it. That was the whole of the story. In the end, not a woman who had been rescued. Not a woman who had been transformed by circumstances into someone new, but a woman who had always been exactly who she was, in a world that kept insisting she was something less, until she found the place and the work and the person alongside whom she was finally allowed to be precisely, completely, usefully herself. Cliff's face went rust, and then gray, and then the color that had no name. Mabel Wren drank her coffee and watched it, and was content with what she had built, and went inside when the light was gone to begin tomorrow's work.